Have you ever had responsibility for a public event that went wrong? Has that ever happened to you? Well, today we're looking at one of those events in the life of Jesus. It's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, the first 11 verses. For those of you who are visiting with us, we're studying the Gospel of John on Sunday morning. I've entitled this, A Wedding Headed South. Let me tell you about my experience at the second church I pastored in Tennessee. We had not been there very long, and I had a bright idea. And since then, I've sworn off my bright ideas. I told Nancy, I said, let's invite the deacons and their wives over for a meal at our house. And she said, sure, we can do that. And there were 7 deacons and their wives. So there'd be a total of 16 people there. And I thought, well, pork chops probably would go well, barbecued pork chops. And so I said to Nancy, I'll take care of the pork chops, and if you'll take care of the rest. So that's the way it worked. Well, that evening they started coming in, and I would go out and greet them and welcome them inside, and then I'd go run out to the grill and see how it was coming. And it started getting sort of dark, and people kept coming in. I kept running out, and I just remember somewhere in my past that I heard that if you're going to have pork, you need to really grill it good. You don't want to get people sick. I heard this long word, trichinosis. I don't know. It still sticks in my mind. It may not have anything to do with pork, but it came to my mind. And so I kept grilling these pork chops. And finally, I felt, okay, maybe they're done. But I thought maybe just a little bit more, Well, brought them in, and, they looked pretty good. The barbecue looked pretty good, a little crispy, but I thought this is going to be fine. So we had the prayer, we dug into the food, and I bit into mine, and I could barely crease it. And I sort of started looking around, and all the others, they were working on theirs the best they could. And the longer it went, the smaller I felt as the evening went on, because those pork chops, they were harder than bricks, I'm telling you. The deacons and their wives, they were so kind about it, they didn't say a word. But after it was over, I said, Nancy, if I ever have another bright idea like that, you slap me as hard as you can. Whew, I tell you, that was a rough one. So you may have had an experience of some kind of a public event that you were responsible for, and it didn't turn out quite the way you wanted to. Let's read this story and see what it may have to say to us today about Jesus. On the third day, there was a wedding feast. Now, our custom about weddings and Jewish customs about even today are different, but back then really so. Our wedding customs here is usually you have a wedding rehearsal on one night, have a dinner, go out for dinner, then you have the service the next day, the ceremony the next day, and have a reception, and then it's done. But to the Jews, no, it usually lasted about a week. They would have the supplies, food brought in, and prepared for people coming in at all times of the day and the evening. And so this was not just an event like we normally have it. It lasted a good while. It happened in Cana of Galilee. This is where Nathanael, we looked at Nathanael last week. He was one of the earlier disciples. He was from Cana, about 9 miles north of Nazareth, where Jesus grew up. So it was close by. No doubt this could be a relative that was having this wedding or a friend, but we know that Jesus' mother was there, it says in verse 1. And the reason why she's mentioned up front is because she must have had some role to play in supplying of the refreshments and so on. Jesus and his disciples were called to the marriage feast. By this time, he had about 6 disciples. Could have been more, but we know of 6, James and John, Andrew and Peter, and Nathanael and Philip. So there they came, And during the time that they were there, the wine began to run short. And his mother said to him, they have no wine. And what she was saying is, I'm in a heap of trouble here. This is not good, because if you run out of stuff and you're supposed to supply it, this is not going well. And the best she could do is turn to her eldest son, Jesus, and see if he might be able to do something about it. And then we hear him say this, woman, what is that between me and you? We'll come back to that because it does sound strange. My hour has not yet come. And his mother then said to the servants, whatever he says, do it. And there were 6 stone water pots there. We'll talk about this as well in just a minute. For the purification of the Jews, each one having about 2 or 3 measures. A measure was about 9 or 10 gallons each. And Jesus said to these servants, he said, fill these water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. There would be somebody responsible to sort of see everybody was seated properly and all of that stuff. And so they brought it. And when the chief or master of ceremonies tasted the water, it had become wine. And he did not know where it was from. But the servants knew, the ones who drew the water. And the master of ceremonies said to the bridegroom, he said, all men, it's a sort of a proverb, first places the good wine, and then later when men have well drunk, they put out the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. And the story stops right there. And then the narrator, the author, says this beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Well, as we look at this story, this may be familiar for you, some it may not be, but secondary questions have tended to overshadow this particular event. Let me tell you some of these secondary questions. One is, some have looked at this and says this is to show how Jesus sanctifies a particular marriage or the office of marriage itself. I have in my office a number of ministers' manuals on how to do things, baptisms, Lord's Suppers, weddings, funerals, and so on. In every one of them, they will include this story and say that Jesus confirms marriage. He shows up here. And they see that as a primary conclusion of this story. But that's a secondary issue. It's not a primary one. Others have looked at this to promote the consumption of wine or alcoholic beverages. I can't tell you through the years how many people have said to me, Jesus drank wine and we should too. Is that what this story is about? I don't think so. It's secondary, not primary. Others have looked at this and said this is an explanation of how in the communion service, when the priest declares the water turning into wine and into the blood of Christ. It's an explanation of how that happens, a transformation into the blood of Christ. Again, that's a secondary issue, not a primary one. And then there are others that fasten on this very first phrase, the third day. And they say that symbolizes the third day of Jesus' resurrection, that he was raised from the dead on the third day. Again, that may be a secondary question, but it is certainly not a primary one. Well, what is it then? Well, it's in verse 11. Verse 11 is the primary concern of the passage. And he says, this beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory. That's what this story or event is about. It's about Jesus' glory being manifested. And if you go back to the last verse of chapter 1, you'll see this is one of the things that the disciples were promised that they would see. Notice verse 51 of chapter 1. He said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, you shall see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Who's the Son of Man? Jesus. He's the Son of God and he's the Son of Man. And so Jesus is now fulfilling to his disciples, you're going to see some greater things. And boy, he just really showed him something in this. And showing his glory. If you remember also in chapter 1, verse 14, it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his what? Glory. The glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. This story is revealing God in the flesh and his glory. Jesus is the embodiment of God on earth. Well, the question then becomes, how does this event reveal the glory of God in Jesus? Let me suggest a few things. One is this, that Jesus demonstrates his creative authority over nature. In verse 9 it says, when the master of ceremonies tasted, he said this water had become wine, and he did not know where it came from. They had already used the best wine first, and now they were trying to put the less out there. So he creates, or Jesus is a co-creator with God, and thus has authority over it. In chapter 1, again, verses 1 through 3, we read, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This one was in the beginning with God. And nothing came into existence, or all things came into existence through him, and apart from him, nothing was made that was made, not one thing. Jesus, the embodiment of God on earth, is the co-creator with God in the beginning over nature and has authority over it. In this gospel, he does this several times. He feeds over 5,000 people with a little boy's lunch. PB&J sandwich. No, not quite. If it was done today, it probably would have been that. But back then, it was some fish and a loaf or two of bread. He fed over 5,000 people. Well, he created the fish, didn't he? He created the bread. He's exercising authority over nature. Also in John's gospel, Jesus walks on water. I do not recommend that to many people. But Jesus, yes, he walked on water. He created the water. Remember, God created in the beginning. Jesus was his agent. There he created the heavens and the earth and the waters. He calmed the sea. The waves came up, the wind came up, and Jesus calmed the storm. In chapter 9, he heals a blind man from birth, exercising authority over that. And finally, in chapter 11, the last of the 7 signs, he raises a dead man from life. Jesus is the creator of life, and he can give life to dead things and to dead people. So Jesus is demonstrating his creative authority over nature. Now, here in this particular story, it's in 2 ways that he's demonstrating his creative authority. One is by the quality of the wine. What did the master of ceremonies say? You have reserved the what? The best until now. This is the best wine it could ever be made. I mean, I'm not I'm not a very cultural person. I'll admit that. I am more corn on the cob kind of person. But down on 30A, they have a lot of these wine tasting things, and wine and cheese and things like that. And they wanted to have the best vino, and hold up the little glass and look at it and things like that, looking for the best. You're not going to get any better than what Jesus did right here, the creator of heaven and earth. So creative authority by the quality of it and the timing of it. Wine comes from grapes. It comes from the sunshine that warms the grapes. It comes from the rain and the vine itself. God created all that. What he did here was simply speed up the process. It takes a while for grapes to become wine. Jesus speeded it up just like that. Creative authority over nature. That's one thing we see of God's glory being manifested in Jesus. Here's a second one. He brings freshness of life instead of ritual. Notice there were 6 stone water pots there. They were for the purification of the Jews. They were used for washing hands. They were used to wash the utensils, the cups and the plates and things like that. Here's what Mark 7:3 says about this, helps us understand it. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the traditions of the elders. This was done primarily not for hygiene. That's what we do it for. But for the Jews, it was a religious thing. It was you had to do it properly or you could be contaminated. You could be unclean spiritually. And so these 6 stone water pots, that's what they were there for. But what does Jesus do? He says, fill them up. Fill them up. He told the servants to fill the water pots, and they filled them up to the brim. And in the process, this water was turned into wine. They were told to draw some out and take it to the master of ceremonies. What Jesus is doing here, he is replacing rituals of Judaism for the freshness of life that only God can offer and bring. God desired the same thing from his people, but they replaced heart worship with ritual. Listen to what God says in Isaiah 29:13. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Mere ritual still saps the freshness of life that Jesus offers. Last week, I shared with you an event that happened in our church in Tennessee years ago. It happened during our 3rd year that we were there, where God did amazing things. People were transformed, literally transformed. And it was marvelous to behold, to be a part of it. Well, if you remember, I told you about little Sonia. She's about 5 foot high. She and 2 of the other ladies in our church went to visit this young lady. Her name was Patricia. And as they were there visiting with her, they talked about the weather, the kids, and everything else under the sun. And finally, toward the end, Sonia said, "You wouldn't want to talk about Jesus or know anything about Jesus, would you?" And she said, "Well, yes, I would." And so she went ahead the best she could and shared Jesus with Patricia. And Patricia accepted Christ there in her living room that evening. I'll tell you what, Patricia brought a freshness to our church like you wouldn't believe. She came in, she was one of those bubbly kind of people. You ever had known somebody like that, just sort of bubbly? Just excited to be around them. She was like that. Jesus had changed her life. But she came to church in blue jeans. Now, think about this. That's not a problem for us today, most likely. But back in the 70s, in small town Tennessee, that was an issue. Women didn't dress like that coming to church. Women wore dresses. and that sort of looked really nice. She wore blue jeans, and she was just as happy as she could be. I was so thankful to our ladies in our church. They never once said anything to Patricia, never once. And she just brought life into our congregation. It was just wonderful to be around her. However, Patricia had a grandmother that went to another kind of church, and her grandmother began to share with her if she was going to be a godly lady, she needed to start wearing long dresses and sleeves down to the wrists and pull your hair back in a bun. And when you come into church, you ought to wear a little thing on the top of your head to represent submission. And over a period of time, we noticed that Patricia lost her smile. And then a little time later, you could begin to see her just sort of like being deflated, like a balloon being deflated. And over a period of time, she stopped coming to our church and started going to her grandmother's church and sat right next to her grandmother like this every Sunday. Ritual can become so routine, and you think that life comes from the ritual. Jesus says it doesn't come from the ritual, it comes from the heart. It comes from me, Jesus says. God in the flesh. So Jesus brings freshness of life instead of ritual. He brings something else. He places God's will over family ties. Let's get back to that part where his mother said, they don't have any wine. I'm in trouble here. I need help. What are you going to do about it? And Jesus says to her, woman, what is that between me and you? My time has not yet come. Sounds harsh, doesn't it, to our English ears? However, again, we must understand the Bible in its cultural context. Back in those days, and to some degree even for us today, I'll explain it to you in just a minute, conversation between men and women depended on whether it was public or private. Because this event was public, Jesus was being formal. There were other people around. And the same word that he uses here is used when he addresses his mother from the cross when he's dying. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. Same word. Again, the cross was a public place. Even when he was dying, Jesus knew where he was and how he should act. Now, we do that a little bit today, not as near as much as they did back in those days. Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm introducing Nancy to somebody. We're somewhere at some event or something. I say, this is my wife, Nancy. It sounds very formal, doesn't it? That's the way you would say something like that in public. Well, I don't go around saying to her at home, you're my wife, Nancy. I don't do that. I generally call her babe or something like that. Is that all right? Is that okay? We still do that a little bit today, but back in those days, it was very important where you were, how you treated and spoke to people. So for Mary, his mother, this did not come across as harsh at all. It was simply public conversation between two adults, a male and a female. But what Jesus is doing, he's putting priority on being guided by God's direction for his life rather than the pull of family ties. He does go on and meet this need, but it is on his terms, not his mother's. He said, my hour is not yet here. Jesus was doing what he called his disciples to do. Remember, as he was going along calling disciples, they would leave their family business and put Jesus as priority. Jesus demands that of any of us, that he comes before our nearest and dearest. Let me give you an example of that. When I was teaching in the seminary in Canada, we had a young couple to come from British Columbia. The seminary is located in Alberta. And as I got to know this couple, I found out something about them that sort of put a little special place in my heart for them. The day they loaded up their U-Haul to come to seminary, her dad stood on their front lawn and told him, "You are making the biggest mistake of your life. You have got to be a fool to take your wife and these 2 children over to that school over there to God knows what's going to happen. You ought to stay here. Do your life here." What are you going to do? That couple felt God speaking to them that they ought to go to school and be trained and go on and to serve in Christian ministry. They came on anyway. It was not a happy leaving from British Columbia. But through the 3 years, it takes 3 years to get a Master of Divinity degree, they continued to relate to her dad as best they could. They'd go back and make visits the best they could. But something good happened. In that 3-year time period, her dad accepted Jesus as his Lord and Savior. And when he graduated, the young man did, he was there that day and he was standing in line to welcome them and hug them. I just sort of stood off in the side and thought, my goodness, what a change Jesus can make in people. And to know that that couple stuck to their guns and said, we're going to follow God's direction for our life, even if it means going against mom or dad. Jesus says that. He is priority. Finally, one more thing, and it comes from verse 11. This beginning of the signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. You see, the abundance of wine was the sign and the symbol of the arrival of Messiah. It was the abundance of wine that signified when this Messiah comes, it's going to be wonderful. We're going to have abundance of everything. And wine, they couldn't think of anything better than an abundance of wine. Listen to Genesis chapter 49, verses 10 and 11. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. What tribe was Jesus from? Judah. Nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. Do you see that? I mean, the vines are so big and thick that they could tie a colt up to it and not be pulled away. You see the abundance of this? He has washed his garments in wine. It's so abundant, more so than water. Wow, it's big. And his vesture in the blood of grapes. That's in the book of Genesis. Then let's hear from the prophets. Isaiah 25, verse 6. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. What did the master of ceremonies say? You have kept the what? The best wine. Excuse me, I get a little excited occasionally. And Joel chapter 3, verse 18 says, and in that day the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk, and all the stream beds of Judah shall flow with water, and a fountain shall come forth from the house of the Lord. Jesus is the house of the Lord on earth. He is the locus between heaven and earth. The angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. This is the gate of heaven, the household of God. So we see from the law and the prophets this event is the sign of the age of salvation. The Messiah has come. The precious wine of the gospel is here. It's abundant and it's free and it's for everybody. Listen to Isaiah 55:1. He says, "Come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price." This is why the author would say, this beginning of the signs, Jesus is manifesting God in the flesh. He is the Messiah. And it's party time. It is party time. The abundance of wine is the symbol of the coming of the King of Kings and the Messiah of Israel and of the church. I've got to quit. I've got to quit. Let's pause.